Hello, and welcome to Gray Muscle. Today we're going to talk about books that I think you should be reading if you're interested in building muscle and improving your overall physical fitness. The first book I recommend is a book called Brawn. This is a fairly thick book, and it starts with the basics and works up to some more complicated processes for lifting weights. What I liked was that it had a very specific approach to weight training that I found useful when I was first starting to lift weights. I will say that in this book, one of the gems that I pulled out was the use of small weight increments as we continue to push closer and closer to our 1 rep max. The beauty of using a 2.5 pound increment, which is not easy to do because 2.5 pound plates on each side is 5 pounds. So you're literally talking about finding something half that size. But through small changes, you can make big changes over time. And I love that idea. This is a fairly thin, small book, and it's fairly popular. The idea is that through squatting, you can really advance your physique. And in particular, they talk about this concept of really pushing yourself way beyond where you thought you might be able to go in squats. They talk about a 20 rep squat at a weight that I believe is 75 or 85% of your 1 rep max, a truly Herculean effort. And so I think this concept kind of epitomizes the whole concept of intensity. Now, this isn't the intensity that we talked about in an earlier lecture where we were talking about intensity being bar weight. Here, intensity is just how hard you have to work. And if your RPE is not near 10, it should be. The reps in reserve at the end of a 20 rep squat at that percentage of your 1 RM would be very close to 0. I like the anatomy for strength and fitness training. There's a lot of anatomy books. This shows several exercises, and then it shows the muscles that are being worked with each exercise. This is, or some similar book to this, should be part of your library. It'll tell you which muscles are being used, and it gives you a visualization in your mind of the muscle as you're actually going through the motion. One of the things I found that was helpful was a coloring book. So I know it sounds a little childish, but it's actually a great way for you to learn the various body types for your anatomy. So going through the coloring book with a set of coloring pencils and coloring the muscles that you're going to be working can turn out to be a very helpful exercise. So I recommend this. This may not seem like a book on training for physical fitness, but it actually is. Atomic Habits talks about, and James Clear is an excellent writer, talks about how simple, small changes done consistently over time can yield huge results. And if that doesn't speak to us as people who lift weights and people who are trying to change our diet, I don't know what does. This is a very clear and concise book. I highly recommend it. And when you read it, think about not only habits in your everyday life, but habits in your physical fitness. As we talked about diet earlier in a previous presentation, a lot of the material that I got from that came from this book from Max Lugavere. This book on genius foods, he lists 10 what he calls genius foods, foods that help us, I don't want to say be smarter, but it improves our brain health. We're talking about extra virgin olive oil, salmon, almonds, dark chocolate, and so on. There's several things. He lists 10 genius foods. But the preamble to the listing of those 10 foods, I think, is very instructive. And he talks about, with a lot of backup and a lot of evidence, why whole food type diets and diets that do include a lot of fats and proteins are actually good for us. One of the genius foods that he has is organic free range beef. So he's not anti-red meat. He's just talking about the foods that he has seen evidence that actually make us smarter and hold allow us to hold on to our mental acuity. Just for a compelling motivational read, I suggest Education of a Bodybuilder by Arnold Schwarzenegger. This was something maybe the first book I read on weightlifting. I found that it had a lot of stories in there about his early training, about some of his relationships with some of the other bodybuilders, and his mentality for how to win. I just found it really compelling, and I think it's a book that should be in your library. The EliteFTS workouts and programs can be found on the EliteFTS website. The primary guy at EliteFTS is a guy named Dave Tate, but this workout book, which I believe is 260 pages long, um, includes workouts from a wide variety of people. All of these people are very knowledgeable, and I highly recommend this. There's a workout and a program in this book for you, trust me, probably several, and he gives very good reasoning in each one of them for the type of workout. Um, EliteFTS also has a great presence on the web, a YouTube channel. They have a lot of podcasts. And I'll talk about EliteFTS repeatedly throughout because I believe Dave Tate is one of the smartest people in this business. Dave Tate came out of a lifting West Side Barbell Club, which was a club that has lifters that have broken dozens and dozens of world records for powerlifting. So his mentality has been more along the powerlifting line, but he certainly includes bodybuilding, CrossFit, and many other types of physical fitness regimes. And he's just incredibly knowledgeable. My only criticism of Dave is that he liberally uses the F-bomb. So you can't listen to this when your kids are around. But outside of that, I think Dave Tate is somebody that you should pay attention to and go to EliteFTS. They've got a ton of other, this programs and workouts is just one of the many things they have. They've got a lot of videos and a lot of articles by top-notch people. Another one of the people at EliteFTS is a fellow named J.M. Blakely, who I'll talk about also. Clearly very smart. I think he has a PhD in some of the sciences. So anyway, more on those guys. In a prior presentation, when we talked about diet, we also mentioned this fellow Brad Schoenfeld, and Brad wrote a book called The Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy in the early 2010s, and has since continued to develop the science behind it. So by his own admission, there's some things that he would update, and maybe he will update this book. But this gets to the nuts and bolts of muscle hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is the growth of a muscle. That's how you make a muscle grow. And he has really studied this better than anybody, and I recommend his book highly. So here's Gray Muscle's book list: Brawn, Super Squats, Anatomy for Strength and Fitness Training, the Anatomy and Physiology Coloring Book, Atomic Habits, Genius Foods, Education of a Bodybuilder, the EliteFTS Workouts and Programs. It's 226 pages. I think I mentioned 260. And then the Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy by Brad Schoenfeld. So those 9 books I think should be in your library. Now here's a couple other book lists for comparison. So you don't get just my perspective, you get a couple others. Here's the top 10 selling books on physical fitness on Amazon.com. So Kettlebell, Simple and the Sinister, Bigger, Leaner, Stronger, Starting Strength, Tactical Strongman. I think if you look through this list, you won't see much crossover between what I've listed and what's here. Some of these books may be well worth the purchase. For example, the Little Black Book of Workout Motivation, Starting Strength by Mark Rippetoe is one that I've heard is fairly good. But I'll leave it up to you to decide if these are books for you. I don't have them in my library. Top10sups.com, Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. That has actually been recommended by many people, by Robert Kennedy. I think that actually one is one that you'd want. Schwarzenegger wrote a larger compendium of bodybuilding routines called the Bible of Bodybuilding. I do recommend that. So those top 2 are 2 that, although they didn't get on my list, are 2 that are worth having. The Strength Training Anatomy is probably the equivalent of the Anatomy and Physiology book that I mentioned earlier in my library. And the Encyclopedia of Muscle and Strength by Jim Stoppani is also highly recommended. So those top 4 are actually really ones that I think would be worth having. Now, Chris Aceto is somebody that's been training many of the top bodybuilders the past decade, maybe 2 decades. And his championship bodybuilding book probably is becoming maybe one of the preeminent books in the industry. Definitely also worth a look. You can see that there's a couple others in here by Bodybuilding Anatomy, Better Than Steroids, Men's Body Sculpting. All of those are probably worth a look, but those first 5 certainly are ones that might be worth a second consideration on my list. Muscleandstrength.com, there's a lot of overlap with the previous list. The Schwarzenegger book at the top, Stepani's book, The Education of a Bodybuilder, which was on my list. And then you'll see further down the Starting Strength, Pumping Iron by Charles Gaines and George Butler. That one is one that's highly motivational. Does provide some stories of the past that I think are interesting. This is the only list that I saw outside of my own that didn't strictly list something that had to do with physical fitness. And that number 10 on the list was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which very famous book by Stephen R. Covey. I recommend Stephen Covey's book, but not high enough to put it on my list. Finally, Anabolic Bodies. They, instead of listing their top 10 books, they just said if you're a beginning bodybuilder, Starting Strength. If you're more advanced, the Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. And then for history, Brother Iron, Sister Steel by Dave Draper. So tell me what topics you're interested in. Send me an email and tell me what you want to hear. And that email address is graymuscle@protonmail.com. And until then, press on.